Toilets are something we take for granted these days. But did you know that medieval toilets were not what you might expect? What would you see if you walked into a medieval bathroom? Welcome back to my channel. Today we're going to learn about medieval toilets. You may think that the toilet is one of the greatest inventions of all time. And while that's certainly nice to have a place where you can sit down and do your business without having to worry about falling into a hole, the truth is that toilets aren't exactly ancient technology. In fact, the modern toilet was invented in the early 19th century. This means that for most of human history, people didn't have access to this luxury. But when we picture a medieval privy, we often imagine a simple hole dug out in the ground. And while this is true in some cases, there was more variation in medieval toilets than you might expect. So let's talk about how they worked and why they smelled so bad. One of the biggest misconceptions about medieval life is that everyone was filthy all the time. It's true that the average person in the Middle Ages had much less access to hygiene products than we do today. But they weren't walking around knee-deep in their own filth either. For one thing, water was too precious a resource to waste on cleaning. People would use rainwater for drinking and cleaning, and that water wasn't exactly clean to begin with. There's also the fact that washing yourself could make you sick. This was because the human body has good bacteria on it that helps keep us from getting sick. When you wash yourself, you wash away those helpful bacteria along with the bad stuff. However, since the Black Death had ravaged Europe and killed millions, people were pretty paranoid about germs. This led to an obsession with cleanliness. People believed that if they could just scrub themselves clean enough, they would never get sick again. Unfortunately, they didn't know any better. Scrubbing yourself raw would remove those helpful bacteria and leave you vulnerable to illness. This is why hand washing stations often came equipped with a sign that warned people not to wash themselves too much. So why did they care so much about germs if they didn't know about bacteria? Well, they saw disease as an imbalance of the humors. The four humors were phlegm, yellow and black bile, and blood. If someone was healthy, they had the correct balance of these humors inside their body. When someone got sick, it meant that one or more of their humors was out of whack. To treat the illness, they would add or remove one of the humors to bring the body back into balance. So if someone had a fever, they would induce vomiting to get rid of some of the hot blood. This isn't very effective treatment, and many times it made things worse. But people truly believed that this was how the world worked. The Black Death had killed millions of Europeans, and no one wanted to get sick. This led to an increased interest in sanitation and waste disposal. But even though people knew that human waste made them sick, they still used it as fertilizer for their crops. Speaking of waste disposal, what happened to it after it was used as fertilizer? That depends on where you lived. In the countryside, people often had a privy in their home, but sometimes they would just dig a hole and call it a day. In larger cities, they couldn't really do this, so the waste had to be taken somewhere else. Medieval London had a pretty advanced waste disposal system, especially compared to other cities at the time. They had several large sewers that ran beneath the city streets. These sewers were open, though, so people had to walk across them on bridges. They would often defecate on these bridges, which would then fall into the river below. Yikes. So what about those famous medieval toilets with the holes in the street? They were usually installed in public buildings like inns and alehouses, but sometimes you could find them in private homes too. They consisted of a wooden box with a hole cut into the bottom and a small platform underneath. A typical height was about 18 inches, which was just barely higher than a person's knees. Often these toilets were set up over top of a privy, so the waste would fall right into a hole in the ground. Sometimes they would put a bucket under them instead, which would then need to be emptied. The bucket toilets were more common in wealthier homes, since they were able to afford the extra step of having someone empty the buckets and deal with the waste another way. These toilets were not very comfortable, and most people wouldn't want to sit down on them. Instead, they were designed to be used while standing. This makes sense, considering the alternative was squatting down over a hole in the ground. At least on the toilet, you could rest your arms on the sides of the wooden box. The phrase, "don't sit on the toilet," doesn't just come from parents. who want their children to stop playing on the porcelain throne. Here's a very practical reason for it. Sitting down on a medieval toilet could break the thing. They weren't built to support a lot of weight, and a hefty person could easily snap the platform. Since these toilets were usually built by a carpenter and not a plumber, they were often flimsy at best. People would sometimes build their toilets out of whatever materials they had available, including old barrels. These barrels would break down over time and collapse under someone's weight. But most of the time, the toilets were simply constructed of wood. While strong, wood is also a bit unpredictable. Over time, it can warp or crack, making the toilet less sturdy. It is likely that a medieval toilet would only last a few years before it needed to be replaced. Unlike modern toilets, medieval toilets weren't attached to a wall. Instead, they sat freely on the floor, which meant they could be moved around. This was useful for two reasons. First of all, if a privy needed to be dug in the yard, the toilet could be moved outside. Secondly, during the summer months, the privy would often become infested with maggots. To prevent this, people would move their toilets into a different room during the warmer months. In some ways, the wealthy were better off than the poor when it came to toilets. As we mentioned before, they could afford to have a bucket toilet. This meant that the waste didn't just drop immediately into a hole, and that reduced the chances of disease spreading. The downside was that someone had to empty the bucket, and that job was often given to the lowest servant in the household. While emptying a bucket of human waste might not sound like a big deal, it actually was. Not only were these buckets heavy, but they were also extremely smelly. The workers who emptied the buckets were often given a small fee and a new bucket to replace the dirty one. Sometimes the servants had help, though. In bigger cities, there were professional bucket and cesspool emptiers. These men would go from house to house collecting the buckets of waste. Then they would take the buckets to a cesspool on the outskirts of town and dump them in. This job was considered so repulsive that people often paid others to do it for them. It was dangerous work as well, because there were frequent accidents. The handles on the buckets were often worn smooth from being carried around all day, and it was easy to lose your grip. If a bucket fell, the contents would spill onto the person carrying it. Not only would they be covered in human waste, but that they would also be covered in flies and maggots. These accidents were so common that there was even a song about them. Now, you know why medieval toilets smelled so bad. But did you know that they were also colorful? Potty humor is nothing new. People in the Middle Ages liked to decorate their toilets with images that were funny, gross, and sometimes both at the same time. Medieval artists weren't shy when it came to painting toilets, and they would often include them in scenes of everyday life. One example is a painting called Christ in the House of Mary and Martha by Peter Bruegel the Elder. He depicts Jesus visiting two sisters, and they are sitting down to dinner. In the foreground, we can see a man using a toilet in a very realistic manner. Other paintings show toilets decorated with bright colors, while others depict them in a more realistic style. One popular design featured blue and white tiles, which were arranged to look like a woman's skirt. The woman's face would be painted in the middle of the toilet seat. Sometimes the women depicted were famous figures like Queen Elizabeth. The first and other popular decoration was the painted eye, and you can see one on our toilet in this video. This design consisted of a realistic eye staring directly at whoever used the toilet. Sometimes the eye would wink at you, but sometimes it would roll in its socket or pop out, like in this picture. Imagine having to sit down for a no, too, with that staring at you. Creepy and cool at the same time. If you enjoyed learning about medieval toilets, be sure to hit a like. We will soon upload lots of other videos about life in the Middle Ages. And to keep learning about daily life in the past, subscribe our channel. Click here to watch this video on how medievals survived winters. Thanks for watching. Bye.